I grew up learning that human beings use only 10% of our brain power. Have you ever heard that? We learned that in school. Doing research for this homily, I learned that that's actually not true. The neuroscientists have realized, oh no, further research shows we use all different parts of our brain. But there's a reason why that myth endures, I think. It's because we recognize how many areas of our life have untapped potential within them. And so it's believable that we're not using all of our brain because there's so many other parts of our life that we're not fully utilizing. We know that about ourselves. Jesus brings up one of those today. He says, we are only using 10% of our faith. 10%. So the question is, what would happen if we used the other 90? The apostles asked him what we would ask him naturally too. Lord, please give me more faith. This life is hard. I need more faith to get through this. And Jesus says clearly today, no, you don't need more. You need to learn how to use fully the faith that you have. If we learn how to use it fully, we'll realize we have more than enough. The issue is that a lot of us equate faith with believing in God. We think if someone believes in God, then they have faith. But belief in God is only about 10% of faith. And it's the shakiest 10%. And here's why. Because something might happen in life that you didn't expect, that doesn't seem fair, and it will cause you to wonder if there is a God, or if there is, does God care about me at all? If that hasn't happened to you yet in life yet, it's going to happen. The other thing that might happen is because we believe in God, we start praying and asking God for things in our life. We'll either say, Lord, help me with this, or spare my loved one from that. And when we do that, we may not realize it, but we attach a timeline to the request. If you do it by this date, then I'll know that you did it. And if you don't, then I'll feel abandoned. And then we set ourselves up, because then maybe what we prayed for doesn't happen. Has that ever happened to you before? And then you're left with, God, are you there? Do you even care? So belief is the shakiest 10% of our faith. And we run into this all the time. Haven't you had a conversation with somebody, maybe a friend, who says, I used to go to church, but then that scandal happened, I lost my faith. Or maybe you've heard somebody say this, I used to go to church, but that pastor, 3 or 4 pastors ago, he wouldn't let me get married on the day that we planned in the church, or we had a fight over a baptism, and I lost my faith. And you know, those things might be legitimate. They may be legitimate things. And you could understand if they reduced your faith by maybe, say, 10%. But where's the other 90%? Could we lose our faith that easily? What about the other 90%? So that brings up what faith needs to have to be faith. We need to have patience with God. You can't have faith without it. We know this from life. You can't have a good marriage without patience. You can't be an effective parent without patience. And you can't have a good relationship with God unless you have patience. It's the same way. That's why the book of Proverbs says, the patient person is mightier than a warrior. Patience is the ingredient that we need so that we don't get too attached to our timeline for what we want God to do. That's what we hear in the first reading today with that prophet Habakkuk, or however we're supposed to say his name. It's a long one. He says, don't start doubting that God is at work. Remember the vision. Remember the big picture. You're going to be tempted to say, God, you're late. You've missed the chance. Now it's too late. And the prophet says that is not true. God's timing is perfect. In the fullness of time, things will unfold perfectly, but you need patience. One writer says that the word atheist is just another word for someone who doesn't have enough patience with God. We need patience to have faith. Because the problem is, if we don't have patience, then we start feeling like God has forgotten us. We start picturing God in heaven sitting at a big, messy desk with stuff all over it. And we picture God losing our file. Where did I put that? It was just here a second ago. And then we think, well, great, now God lost my file. I'm a goner. But that's not how God is. And let's talk about that for a second. Let's say God is sitting at a big desk in heaven. What other things besides my file might be on God's desk? Recently, I read that every hour of the day and night, every hour, 1 million new solar systems are born somewhere in the universe. Every hour. Not new planets, new whole solar systems. 1 million an hour. Somewhere else I read that a caterpillar, a common caterpillar, has 228 distinct muscles in its face alone. In its face. So we are part of something much bigger than ourselves. When we start thinking that God has lost our file, we need to remember that we're part of a giant symphony of life, and that sometimes our timeline doesn't make sense. We've got to let it go. It's silly. What would it look like if we utilized the other 90%? What would we be able to do? A person who comes to mind who utilized the other 90% is someone whose family is here today. I'm thinking of Fran Williams. She wound up being diagnosed with a very serious terminal lung disorder that made it hard for her to breathe. And I went to visit her not long before she died. And I asked her questions that made sense to me. I said, "Fran, are you mad at God?" And she looked at me and said, "No. It never occurred to me. Why would I be?" I said, "Well, don't you ask, why me?" She said, "I know why me. It's because I could handle it." So this week, we are being asked if we're willing to dip into the other 90% of unused faith that we have. And maybe a good starting question would be, does that story about Fran, does that resonate with you? Does that make sense to you? Or does it sound foreign? Because that's what we're aiming at. To become mightier than a warrior because of our patience with God. Do we have that kind of patience? Or do we start thinking that God has forgotten us, and so we turn our back on God? We focus too much on the small things, and then we think that our faith is getting shaky when we haven't really utilized most of it. Jesus says to us today that we do not need more faith. We just need to figure out how to use what we've got. And if we do, he promises we will be able to move mountains.